Willkommen in einem anderen Video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 37 of my figure gaming video series. In this video I'll be covering game aids, or what game aids should you include in your game. One of the greatest objectives of a good set of rules is to offer the historical details required to keep players happy while being able to complete a game in a 3 to 6 hour time frame, with a clear objective and a clear winner and loser. While in the most part the length of the game is a simple maths exercise, game turns multiplied by the number of elements, other factors can influence this. One is the effort involved in executing a game turn. The simplest method of ensuring a game turn is completed quickly is to keep things simple. But then we often have to trade off historical accuracy. One way to mitigate this is to ensure players have game aids which make playing the game reasonably easy, even if there is embedded historical accuracy included, which it does represent complexity. There are many types of game aids which you can employ, and in many cases they are influenced by the rules. So I'll first cover the common game aids all players should consider for all rules, and then we'll drill down into single series of rules with common issues and what specific game aids were required to satisfy those issues. The best game aid is an easy-to-reference rules book. SPI used to create board game rules in an 8-point font in 3 columns, which was normally a maximum of 16 pages of standard rules and 2 to 4 pages of special rules. In many cases the rules were much shorter. But what this allowed for was a small document which could easily be cross-referenced during a game. This shows my version of DBN which I use in games. The rules component is 16 pages in length, and I find this format very useful in quickly finding rules. This is, of course, for my own personal use, but it's something other players can do with rules which they may find difficult to cross-reference. Some rules, while they do not follow this format, are nonetheless very referenceable, such as Spearhead. These rules require no homemade compressed reference book rules book format. Of course, 8-point in 3 columns may be rather hard to read for gamers who are aging. 2-column versions may suffice, as this example of the old Core Commander shows. Of course, some rules are so simple and in a small form factor that this may not be required. This is an old copy of Anabasis, which was printed in a small A5 format and consisted of 38 pages of rules. But whatever solution is selected, it greatly assists if the rule book is small enough to be by your side at a game and easy enough to quickly reference that all-important special rule. In many cases, it's not possible to make your rules into a referenceable game aid for a game. Lack of time, difficulty in converting it into a referenceable format, or the game system being too complex may make this very difficult, if not impossible. In these cases, a cheat sheet is useful, which can also be useful if you do have a referenceable rulebook by your side, if at all possible, but if you don't, you may be able to create a sufficiently detailed cheat sheet to play the game off. In some cases, the cheat sheet is embedded into the rules book, as can be seen in this copy of Anabasis. SPI board games would place a charts and tables section in their rules, which was normally a double-sided A4 or could extend to 4 pages. This shows the format, but used for the Core Commander sets of figure gaming rules. In some cases, the cheat sheet is separate, double-sided sheet of cardboard, as this example from WRG 7th edition shows. Most rules have cheat sheets of some descriptions, but their design may not be optimal. In this case, creating your own may be a good idea. The purpose of a quick reference sheet or cheat sheet is to allow a player to avoid referencing the rules while playing a game. This example from Beratung is a reformatted version of LWRS, contains everything a player would require to play a game, ranging from sequence of play, movement rates, combat charts, and any special charts. A really useful cheat sheet is one which a game can be played from without ever referencing the formal rules. This does not include setup and victory condition, as they are separate to or specific to a scenario. The design is very important. When creating this, I was forced to place the critical hit and save values in big font at the top, as I was always getting them mixed up or forgetting them. While an optimal cheat sheet should only be a single sheet of paper, in complex game systems where elements have specific specs, you may need to create a separate cheat sheet. The sheet on the right provides the combat values of the Polish elements and allow for a player to quickly verify the values of his or her elements when combat occurs. In simpler game systems, this may not be required, such as with Napoleonics, but for World War II or Cold War, there is a lot of different weapon systems and their values could differ. The sheet on the left is a scenario setup sheet. While not required to play a game, it speeds up scenario setup greatly and is very useful. We'll discuss this in more detail later. If we are lucky, a single cheat sheet can contain everything required for a game as well as troop type values. This is a cheat sheet from a figure game version of the SPI pre-stag rules, which in this case uses DBMM troop types. Everything required can fit on a single double-sided cheat sheet. I have seen some rather good DBMM cheat sheets similar to this as well. We've covered the basic cheat sheets, however some rules require you to keep track of game turns or other game system features such as demoralization or panic levels. This example from the figure game version of the SPI Napoleon at War, we have a game turn track on the left and an army panic level track on the right. While this can be tracked with pen on paper, this is clear and easier to keep track on a separate sheet with a marker on it, or even if you use a dice instead, than a piece of paper using a pen. Scenario game aids tend to be an area often overlooked in rules. Even if playing points-based games, you may need a scenario sheet which allows you to quickly identify your force mix, deploy terrain and deploy your forces. While you can do this by referencing the rules, it's easier to have something simple to reference. If playing a historical scenario, this is even more important. This shows the Wagram scenario for the figure game version of Napoleon at War or Grosse Schlachten. It clearly shows all deployment, reinforcements and victory conditions as well as terrain position. In historical games, the figure game playing area setup can be an issue. The sheet on the right allows players to understand the terrain required for the playing area. Anything which helps players to quickly set up the playing area and force mixes speeds up playing the game. Creating a rule-specific ruler can assist as well. DBA, DBN and DBM have templates which can assist players in creating rulers which can be used for movement and missile figures or ranges. The idea is to include common rules on the ruler. This example from Napoleon at War shows base widths from 1 to 7, along with the troop types which move those distances. The red arrow represents artillery range. With this, there is no need to reference a unit movement allowance, and there's no need to use a tape measure or a ruler which is not matched up with your rules. The ruler template is glued on a piece of pine, which is the required length. You could glue it on a piece of cardboard as well. This is highly rules dependent, but players can create other game aids which assist players in conducting movement, combat or ensuring they are the correct distance from each other. This is for the Napoleon at War set of rules, or Grosse Schlachten, and is the size of a movement zone of control which is used to regulate movement and combat. This shows how they're used. As you can see, it can get rather crowded, and a game aid such as this can ensure units have the correct spacing. This can also allow the phasing player to avoid enemy movement zones of control. Other rules could use something like this to indicate missile range or any other specific feature built into those rules. Movement trays could be counted as a game aid, allowing players to move more than one element together. This depends on the rules, and I must admit movement trays do have a negative bling impact, but they do speed up play dramatically if the rules support movement trays. Now we come to those game aids I really dislike, but you have sometimes no choice but to use them. The counter, which indicates some game system state. In this case, this indicates one of the units are active or is active. This shows some of the common counters which could be used in many different sets of rules. The counters here are for another set of rules, a board game converted into a figure game but played on a hex regulated system, which is the SPI pre-stags, and the counters work reasonably well in these rules. Let's go through some of the counters. First is disorder. This is a common state for a lot of rules. In this case, I need to track a first and second disorder, so the counter can be flipped to reflect this. This shows a casualty counter. In this case, the commander has taken one hit and the effect is reduced, or the effect of the commander is reduced. This counter indicates this unit is engaged. This indicates the unit is in combat with another enemy unit and cannot move. Let's look at another set of rules, in this case LWRS or Figurenspiel. This counter is an order counter. In this case, the unit must attack. This shows a hit marker. This indicates the number of hits the unit has suffered. Once enough hits are suffered, an element is removed. While counters do vary dramatically by rules, there are a number of standard ones. Disorder and possibly second disorder, hits and casualties are reasonably common. I print the counters, glue it on a thick cardboard and cut them out. It's important to use an appropriate colour, otherwise it will have a really negative bling impact. I try and make non-important counters roughly the colour of the playing area, and things which really are important like casualties and hits, something like red or yellow. Now let's drill down into the game aids which are required to start a game. This is a specific scenario detailed game aid, which I've briefly touched on earlier for a different set of rules. This is a scenario sheet for BB&B, in this case Ligny and Quatre Bras. Everything you need, which includes playing area setup, should be provided for the player to quickly set up the playing area, assemble their force mix, deploy initial forces, and indicate the clear victory conditions and game length, which allows the player to end the game with a clear winner and loser. You may now ask, what about players who do not wish to produce or reproduce a historical conflict and want some sort of points-based system? If the points-based rules you are using allows you to have a conflict between equal force mixes, then you need army lists. Players can construct their army prior to the game and arrive with their completed force mix. In this example, DBMM, the playing area is typically very basic, so simple rules can be used to deploy terrain, and off you are for a game. Rules such as DBM even allow you to quickly create force mixes on the fly. 12 points per core, and most elements are 1 point, allows a player to quickly create a 3-core force mix in a few minutes if they so desire. Now, while DBN works well in an equal force mix situation, this was actually not a typical historical situation. Many Napoleonic battles were uneven, with reinforcements arriving at various points in the game. But as an equal force mix set of rules, the army list in DBM work very well indeed, and I have to admit I would probably restrict myself down to only a single core per side. It tends to work best in that situation. When dealing with non-equal or asymmetrical force mixes, one solution is to create a defense and attack force mix for each side, using a basic scenario. An example is the basic scenario I use for LWRS, where one player is the defender and the other the attacker. The defender is outnumbered in the first half, and then in the second half that gets reinforcements, which means the attacker is now outnumbered. This shows the Polish 1939 defense and attack force mix. This works, but has two major issues. Your scenario document becomes rather large. The WW2 or World War II scenarios run into hundreds of pages, covering all possible combatants and periods, for example. The other issue is the scenario is very basic, and after playing it a few times, you've exhausted its potential, even if you try different force mixes. It's a lot of work for not a lot of games, but does give you a quick way of starting up a game. One method which one of my gaming comrades raised was to use cards. I suspect this idea came from all the Euro games he plays. As he has daughters, these types of games are very popular with him and his daughters. In this case, each player selects cards from a deck of, let's say, 9. Each card contains the details of a single corps. Now, depending on the rules, it could be a division, brigade, or whatever. Again, depending on the scale of the rules, but in this case, it's corps. Each corps has a points value for entry at the beginning, at the quarter point, halfway point, 3/4 point, and it varies accordingly. So you can build up a points mix of 48 points. Your opponent does the same. This typically only takes 5 to 10 minutes to do. And hey presto, you can start playing. The rules used for this version of cards are from a figure game version of the SPI Napoleonic War, although the system could be used for any other type of rules. Originally, I used a system of random selecting. You dice up the cards and randomly select and build your force mix. However, quite frankly, in the end, I found this pointless. It's best to just give each player the 9 cards and they just simply build their force mix accordingly. Let's take a look at this force mix here. In this case, on the left, we have the 4th Corps and the 6th Corps arriving on game turn 1. That's 12 points each because it's at the start, so it's 24 points. We have the Reserve Cavalry Corps arriving at the quarter point, which means it's 12 points. So there's 36 points. And then we have the Reserve Grenadier Corps and the 5th Corps arriving in the halfway point. And at the halfway point, it's 5.5 and 6, so basically 12. We now have our 48 points. Now, in this case, these cards are rather old. I only divide the game up into 3 parts. These days, I divide the game up into 4 parts. Start, quarter, half, three-quarter. But whatever works for an individual player. But nonetheless, the output of this is, here is an army list that players can, within 5 or 10 minutes, quickly whip up a game and a reinforcement schedule, which I've found is extremely useful for ad hoc games. The playing area creation system, another area which needs to be covered. When you have a simple playing area, the rules to set up can be simple, such as DBMM. When you move to a large-scale Napoleonic, World War II or Cold War, the terrain becomes very complex indeed. There are, initially 2 basic systems. The first attempts to use tables, as you can see here. Each player spins a dice, and then that tells them how many, let's say, water features are placed. Then both players spin a dice per 30 centimetres squared to determine how many built-up areas, hills and woods are placed. This works, but it's time-consuming, can result in some unusual playing area. Actually, I personally don't think this works in any way, shape or form, but it was something that I attempted in the old days. If it's simple enough, maybe it would work. Another system is to have a number of standard playing areas, and players can decide which one they're going to use. Once decided, the players would determine force mix, deployments and reinforcements. I tend to prefer this system, however, creating the playing areas to choose from is also not particularly easy. Some players could simply use historical playing areas, such as Eylau on the left and Friedland on the right. However, many battles were unique, so Eylau is a reasonable playing area, I suppose, for most games, but Friedland is probably not, unless you're recreating the historical battle. I suspect someone will need to study all the battles which occurred and group them, so Borodino is similar to Eylau, etc. Once grouped, you could use these groups to create a set of historically feasible playing areas, which could then be selected during using a table or card system. I'm not pretending I've come up with a firm solution in this area, I'm just throwing ideas out at the present moment. Victory conditions are another topic which is often minimised, simplified or ignored. Basing victory on casualty has the risk of both players doing nothing, so you always need geographic victory conditions. This is reasonably simple for historical battles, but for ad hoc battles where the force mix is a variable, it's not easy to create a balanced game. I suppose a table would need to be created where you cross-reference the force mix ratio with a geographic victory point system. For mobile force ratios, where the attacker outnumbers the defender a lot initially, you play along the long axis, in others the short axis. This shows a simple example with 3 objectives. You could also throw in casualties as well, and if your rules support demoralization or army panic, then that would also be a VP trigger. Again, I have no firm solution at the present moment, and it also greatly depends on the rules. But these days I typically have 3 basic victory conditions and a couple of basic rules up front. My objective for all this sort of stuff is to make it really simple and quick and easy to start the game. And so we come to an end of episode 37, my figure gaming hobby series, in this case creating rivers and road terrain. Alle guten Dingen, kommen zu einem Ende.